Okay, so where are we now? We are in week 11 of this course. And at this point, you finished your drafts of chapter 1, your introduction, and chapter 2, your review of related literature. So now you've really set up your whole project, the overview of what you're doing and the literature related to what you're doing. So starting this week, you're going to start chapter 3, which is the methods of what you're doing. The methods chapter is where you go into great detail on the whole project. What is your design? What exactly are you doing? And in this video, I'm going to give you very detailed information on each of the sections of chapter 3. Before I get started, I just wanted to go over some key due dates for this for the next few weeks. On November 7th, you'll be submitting selected subsections of chapter 3 and getting feedback from me. And then on November 21st is when your completed chapter 3 is due to me. Some key documents and places to look for information on chapter 3. There's really only two places. If you go into Laulima Lessons, if you click on weeks 11 through 14, you will find links to all the key things you need for chapter 3. And really the two documents that you should be referring to throughout the next several weeks is the weekly guidance for developing chapter 3 and the components of chapter 3. So really these two documents will give you all the information you need for what you should be doing every week. Now I'm going to describe what goes into your next chapter, which is chapter 3, methods. This is the chapter where you describe who you're working with, where you're doing your project, what you're doing, and how you're doing it. So what is chapter 3 all about? Basically, start by thinking about this chapter from the reader's perspective and imagine someone asking you the question, so what are you going to do for your master's project? So chapter 3 is where you're really describing what you're going to do. And this graphic here, I think, kind of shows it should be an organized sequence and a logical sequence where you go from one thing to another, explaining what you're doing and how it fits with each other. So in this video, I'm going to go through each of the components of chapter 3, basically all of the subheaders that you're going to have in your chapter. Everything that I talk about in this video is on the components of chapter 3 document that's linked in the Laulima lesson. So everything you can go back and look at, but I'm just going to go into some detail on each of the subsections of chapter 3. So chapter 3 starts off with a short introductory paragraph, and that's just like every chapter, you have something introducing it. This one is not, it's a very brief paragraph, just kind of going into what your project is about, giving the reader, kind of orienting the reader into this action research project or this curriculum development project or whatever it is, and kind of a broad statement on what you're about to describe. Then you get into the real meat of chapter 3, which is you start by describing the setting where you'll be doing your project. For many of you, the setting is a school or a classroom. For some of you, it might be a complex area or your professional organization. So you want to describe the setting broadly. You're not going to give specifics or school names. If you work at a school, you can give it a pseudonym, so don't use your actual school name. And then when you describe where it is, you can say something broadly, like a rural school on Kauai or an urban school on Central Oahu or something. So you don't want to go into too much, you don't want to go into specificity, but you want to kind of say where your setting is located. Then you're going to talk about the setting where you might be actually doing the project. For example, I'm going to be doing this project in an inclusive classroom, an FSC setting, a resource setting, in my complex area, office, wherever. And then you're going to, you might describe other demographic data about your setting. For example, how many teachers are there? How many ELL students? How many students with disabilities? And those demographic things should relate to your project. So the larger demographics that you share about your setting should be things that might be important to know related to the larger picture of your project. Then the next section in chapter 3 will be participants. And this is where you're going to go into detail on who the participants in your project will be. So at this point, you probably have some idea of who your participants will be. Like, for example, you might be thinking, I'm going to do this with 3 students in my classroom, or I'm going to do this with 20 students in my grade level, or I'm going to do this with 15 students in my complex area. So that's what you're going to start describing. You're going to give as much information as you have now. You may not have specific information about the people yet. So if you don't, for example, if you're doing a survey with 15 teachers. You may not yet know everything about them, but you will make a table noting what you're going to get, information you're going to get about the teachers. For example, you might say like licensure levels, numbers of years teaching. So you'll make a table and leave that blank because you'll get the information next semester. If you're working with students and you have an idea of their demographic information, you can put in what you know, and then you can like put a placeholder for the things that you'll add later. Again, in this section, if you're working with individuals, please do not use real names. Use pseudonyms, and you can put you can make up a name and put beside it pseudonym the first time, and then you can repeat that name, and the reader will know that that's not a real name. And so very often in the participant section, you'll have both a narrative about who you're working with, and then there'll be tables that you will add. Usually you'll add the tables next semester with more information about the specific demographics. I really recommend adding tables as placeholders now so that you remember next semester when you actually do the project to come back and fill in those tables. The next section of chapter 3 is role of the researcher. And this is basically the section where you describe who you are in relation to the project, because you are the main researcher for this project. So you're going to describe your own qualifications to work in this setting and do this project. So for most people, this will be talking about what your credentials are as an educator and or a special educator, the number of years you've been teaching or doing your professional work, and then the number of years in the particular setting that you're working in. And then you can add other information as relevant to the project. So what I mean by that is sometimes we have students who want to interview parents of children with disabilities, and they themselves have a child with a disability. So they'll mention that in this section because it's important to them that they want to get this information because they have a personal connection. You're not required to disclose anything personal here if you don't want to, but if there is something about your project and there's a personal connection, this is the place where you can actually say more about that. And then the next section is really the biggie. So procedures is where you'll be spending the most time in chapter 3, because this is where you really describe what you're going to do. This is what your advisor is going to look at in December to give you the go-ahead to do it. This is where you're really going into details about what exactly you're going to do. So I think of it as a blueprint for your plan. So for now, you're going to really think through what you're going to do, include whatever you know now about your project. Very often in this semester, you're going to be coming up with the plan. When you actually do the project in the spring, there might be some shifts, there might be things that change, you might add things. You can come back to this section and flesh it out with what happens, but go ahead and put in what you know now. This section should include what the thing is that you're doing, how you're doing it, when you'll implement it, where you'll implement it. You can have a narrative as well as tables to lay out key information related to it. So very often students will have describe what they're doing in a narrative format, and then the table will have like key visuals or key highlights of things, of the steps that they're going to take. Some people's projects will have multiple stages. Very often with curriculum development or professional developments, people might do like a stage where they're doing a needs assessment, and then they're creating the thing and then implementing it. So if you have something that's in phases, you can in procedures, you can have a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So you can break up the procedure sections with subheadings to make it really clear to the reader, lead the reader through the blueprint of your project. So a very important thing as you write your procedures, write it in future tense. So I will be doing this, I will be doing that. So make sure you do future tense. If you look at the model plan Bs as you're writing this, the ones that are in that set of model ones, you will find that it's in past tense, because what happens is once our students run their projects in the spring, they come back and finish up chapter 3 and they change everything to past tense. So when you read a finished plan B, you'll see it in past tense, but I would like you to write it in future tense now. It's very confusing to try to write in past tense. So go ahead and write it in future tense, and you will change it next semester to something you've already done once you finish it. If you're doing an intervention project with kids, you are going to describe what is the intervention, what are the pieces of the intervention, how will you put it together, how will you incorporate it with the students, how will you implement it, how often will you do that project with the students, what will you do, what will the students do. So you're really like fleshing out, like making a detailed plan for what will happen in the intervention. If you're doing a curriculum development or a professional development project, you're often creating materials first before you implement. So you are going to describe what those materials are, what's going to go in them, what is the content of the materials, how are you going to go about developing it. At this stage, you should put in whatever you already know about your materials. You might actually spend some time in the spring developing it further, but put in whatever you know now about the curriculum or the PD that you're going to develop. If you, for example, are going to do like a needs assessment before you do it, that might be your phase 1, and then phase 2 might be actually developing it, and then phase 3 might be implementing whatever you've developed and getting some feedback on it. So again, this will be different depending on what you're doing, but think of this as a logical plan for what you will do. You want to describe what you plan to develop, outline whatever you know about it now. If there's key constructs related to your projects, make sure that's somewhere in your outline. So for example, if you're using a model or a framework, for example, sometimes our students will be like, I'm aligning this with UDL. Make sure you have like a table showing what you plan to do, where it aligns to UDL. And again, you may not know all the details right now because part of your project is developing the curriculum, but put what you know now and then you'll flesh it out next semester. Another thing, if you're doing a curriculum development or a professional development, you should develop that thing and then you're going to implement it. So you also need to write your implementation plan. Who are you going to try out this curriculum or PD with? How do what do you plan to do? How long will it take? Who will those people be? So again, you are really laying out your procedures for developing whatever you're doing and then implementing it to test it out with the group next semester. Okay, so I just gave you a lot of information on the first few sections of Chapter 3, and now I'm going to go into the next sections, which is data collection and data analysis. But before I keep going on that, I want you to take a pause because I just gave you a lot of information, and I want you to think about what questions you have about the first few sections that I just talked about, which is participants and setting, role of researcher, and procedures. So stop and think for a little while. How are you feeling about that? What are your questions? And then continue watching this video so that you can see an overview of data collection and data analysis. But just know that your first task in the next couple of weeks is to write the sections I've talked about prior to this part of the video. You might want to watch the whole video, focus on those sections I've already talked about, and then review this video later when you're ready to start writing data collection and data analysis after a couple of weeks. So just know that you don't have to try to absorb everything immediately. So going into what goes into data collection. So if you finish writing procedures, you've really written the kind of the longest part of Chapter 3, your methods, and now you're going to go into how are you going to collect data on whatever your project is. So data collection is about gathering information related to each of your research questions. And if you'll recall, when we went over Chapter 1, I actually gave you examples in the Chapter 1 guidance of the types of data collection methods you can have for every research question that you write. So if you need a refresher on that, go back to the guidance document for Chapter 1, and you'll see examples of research questions and what the data collection methods are for each of the RQs in those examples. So in this section, you're going to write a narrative about each of the data collection methods related to your research questions. So you're going to actually write paragraphs saying, I will be using this, this, and this, and then you're going to give more details about those things that you'll be using. And very often you'll put the actual description and the greater details about the data collection methods into the appendices. So for example, if you develop interview questions or survey questions, or you have a template for your field notes, those will all go in the appendices. You'll refer to them in Chapter 3, and you'll say, see Appendix A or see Appendix B for the reader to know that they can go look at the questions in depth. If you are developing a survey or interview questions, it's always good practice to use questions from an article that you found that may have similar questions and modify them. You can cite the article and modify the questions or put together questions from different articles. So you don't have to create them from scratch. If you have found questions in things that you've read for Chapter 2, you can feel free to modify questions. Or even if you found questions from somebody else's Plan B and you're like, oh, I'd kind of like to modify some of these, you can modify it and cite that person's Plan B paper. One of the things in the appendices, you're actually going to put in the data collection protocols, and protocols is just kind of a fancy word for the details of whatever is in your tool. So for example, if you're taking field notes, I really recommend creating a template for what are you going to collect in the field. So if you're going to take daily observation notes, what are you going to look for? So your template might have like observation notes, things that went, challenges that occurred, things that went well. So basically, you're just going to put that template in appendix A or B or C, so that the person reading your chapter 3 can be like, oh, that's the kind of information they're going to collect. If you're developing a survey, you'll put the survey items into one of your appendices. If you're doing interviews or focus groups, you'll put those questions into the appendices. So you're going to refer to it in a narrative in chapter 3, and then you'll say like, see appendix B, and that's where the details of the actual questions will be. So some of these examples are similar to the ones in the Chapter 1 guidance document, but just to kind of give you a refresher here, these are the ways that your research questions link to a data collection method. The information in red on this slide are actually the kinds of methods that the tools that you'll write about. So for example, if you were doing a curriculum development or PD project, you might talk about the components of your curriculum or your PD, and you might actually have field notes when you're implemented of how it went as you were doing the curriculum with students or as you were implementing the PD with teachers. So those are your notes of how things went, and those are actual data that you're going to go back and look at when you're later on in your project. If you're doing, for example, a curriculum development project that you implement with students, some of your data collection methods might be observations of the students as you're implementing the curriculum. You might collect student artifacts as part of your data to see how the students have done with the products that they're making based on your curriculum. So all of those things in red are examples of data collection methods. If one of your research questions are about teacher perceptions of a curriculum or a PD, you might use things like a survey to collect information. You might do interviews, or you might do focus groups. So that really depends on what you're doing and the purpose of your study. Surveys are appropriate if you have many people. So very often, like if you're doing a PD and there's 10 or 20 people, a survey is a good way to get information from that many people. You might have some Likert scale items, you might have some open-ended questions, and get information from a large group. If you have a smaller group of people, for example, let's say you want to interview 6 people in your setting about something, you can do in-depth interviews with them. Sometimes focus groups are appropriate. Focus groups are interviews, except you have several people together to ask the question. So what you will choose really depends on your study and your questions, but these are ways that you collect information on perceptions of something that you've done. And finally, if you're doing a single subject study, or if you're doing a pre-post, if you're doing an intervention and then you're seeing how the students did before and after, your data collection methods might be measures related to the actual outcomes. So for example, that could be like a student product that they're doing after the intervention, that's like a curriculum-based measure, or an assessment that they take after they do whatever the intervention is. So it could be like a pre-post test. If you're doing a single subject study, you might be collecting data during the study of whatever they're doing or whatever you're observing them do. So again, that you're going to be describing in your data collection tool exactly how you're getting data from whatever intervention you're doing in the classroom or single subject study you're doing. So in the Laulima lesson for Chapter 3 and in your guidance document for Chapter 3, I have put links to several resources you can use for reference. So you're not required to look at these, but if you just want to jog your memory of things that you studied in SPED 642 in your research course, or you just kind of need to get your creative juices flowing on what to write, you can take a look at these chapters that are up there as PDFs and get some ideas for what goes in a survey. How do you do observations? How do you use documents? How do you do field notes? So if you go to these pages in the PDF that I've uploaded, you'll be able to find more information on the things that I just talked about. And similarly, if you're doing a single case study, I've put up some PDFs of different single case designs so that, again, this is mainly just a resource for reference if you just kind of need a little bit more information to jog your memory about how people collect data for different types of research designs. And again, as you're doing this, if you need assistance with this, if you're not sure how to do it, you can always reach out to me and or your advisor for assistance as you're figuring out how to write these sections. And again, for those of you doing a single subject study, there are several different single subject designs. And so I have PDFs of all the different types of designs, so you can actually read articles of the different designs if it's relevant to you to see how you want to collect your data. So after the data collection section, you're going to have a data analysis section. And in this section, you're going to describe how you're going to analyze the data you collected. So this section is basically a narrative on how you're going to make sense out of whatever information you've collected. So for qualitative data coding, there are some common steps that you take to look for categories and identify themes. So these are kind of the steps that are taken. If you go into that chapter, in the research textbook that I've uploaded, you can actually find these steps in pages 183 to 190. Usually you organize and prepare whatever data you've collected. That can be like your field notes and your survey data and your interview data. You would read through it all. You would code it, which means you would look for certain types of phrases or themes, and then you would categorize them, come up with themes, and then interpret what that means. So in your data analysis narrative, you will just write up the process that you will take to go through your data. And then the last section that you have in your chapter 3 is credibility. And credibility is basically you're just going to write a narrative on how you're going to establish that what you've done is credible. So the ways that you establish credibility is sometimes triangulation, which means you check with others who have given you the data, like does this look like this, is my analysis of what you said correct? Or a member check is also checking with the people who've given you information. You can use rich and thick description, which is really giving a lot of description about what you do. So basically in this is not a really long section of your chapter 3. It's just kind of a paragraph where you describe what you're going to do to make sure that you're not biased, that you're actually credibly reporting your data. Okay, so that was a lot of information about what goes into chapter 3, and you might be thinking, all right, where do I begin? So just like everything else in this course, when you get started, it seems like a big task ahead of you, but if you whittle away at it step by step, you will actually get this chapter written in the next several weeks. So it's just a matter of kind of going through each section and starting to work on it, and then I'll be giving you feedback, and then you can flesh it out. So you will be able to tackle this. One thing that I recommend doing before you get started is just to get kind of your creative juices flowing. Take a look at some of the Plan B samples. I have linked some specific ones to look at both in the Laulima lesson for chapter 3. You can find this information, and in the weekly guidance for chapter 3 on the second page, I have some information on some examples that I recommend looking at. Now, when you look at other people's Plan Bs, please know that yours is not going to look exactly like anybody's Plan B, because people's procedures are really different. It's like a fingerprint. You're going to have a very individual project, but many elements of your project may be similar to the way that people did things. So I really recommend looking at more than one person's chapter 3, because then you might get some ideas to kind of cut and paste things in the way that you do your own. Like you might think like, oh, I really like the way they describe their procedures, and I really like the way they describe their data, their tools. And so you might put things together based on what you learn from several of them. So again, if you look at in the documents that I've given for you and in the Laulima lessons, you will find some examples that I recommend looking at. Feel free to look at ones above and beyond those examples, but those are some that I picked because I felt the chapter 3s might be useful for other students as well. And also remember, as I said before, when you read the chapter 3s, they have written it in past tense because they were finishing it up in April and May in the spring semester, and they wrote about what they did. When you're writing your procedures and what you're going to do, please write your chapter in the future tense, describing what you will be doing next semester. So here's a roadmap for how to proceed with Chapter 3 in the next several weeks. So in the coming week, week 11, you should start working on Chapter 3, specifically focusing on setting in participants, role of the researcher, and the procedure section. Give yourself the most kind of time and mental space for procedures. That is really the section that takes a lot of time to work out and work through. So if, use that really when you have chunks of writing time, work on those procedures and really start getting into that, because that's also where the most questions come up, and it's good to get started on that early. We will not be having a Zoom meeting next week on November 2nd. However, if you have any questions as you're working, please email me anytime. I'm happy to email back. I'm happy to jump on Zoom or on the phone. So if you find yourself confused, even if it's a small question, if you have writer's block, let me know. I'm here to help you. But you do kind of have a 2-week chunk to write from now until November 7th when you have the next due date. So on November 7th, what you have due is selected subsections of Chapter 3. If you go into the weekly guidance document, you'll see exactly what you're supposed to have done and what you should be completed by November 7th. What I will do is review that on Monday and Tuesday and meet with you individually to give you feedback. So I won't be giving you extensive feedback on the Google Doc, but I will be meeting with you one-on-one on Zoom. So rather than having a class meeting on Tuesday, I will have a sign-up sheet where you can sign up for individual meetings on Monday, November 8th and Tuesday, November 9th. If it turns out that none of the slots that I have up work for you on those 2 days, you can also email me and we can set up a time that works for you. So I will be meeting with you individually after a couple of weeks to give you feedback on where you are. And then after that, you will have a couple of more weeks to finish up Chapter 3 based on my feedback and based on what you've done. We may or may not have a class meeting on November 16th. It will really depend on where you all are and what you need. So depending on how people are doing on their Chapter 3, I might do a full class meeting if it makes sense to give you all information, or I might do office hours for those of you who need help. So I'll decide that after I see how everyone is doing on November 7th and after I meet with you on November 8th and November 9th. And then last but not least, I have been giving you feedback on Chapter 1. You'll see my feedback on your Google Docs. And if I've given you feedback to add or change something similar to what I asked you to do for Chapter 2, please do your additions in a different color and write me a comment letting me know what you've done. So when I review that draft, I know how you took my feedback. And that is it. Thank you for bearing through a fairly lengthy video. And please feel free to review sections as you're writing if you just need a refresher on things that I mentioned in this video. If you have any questions having watched this video, shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer it. If anybody has a question that might be useful for the whole class to know the response to, I will send the response to the whole class. So good luck getting started. I think you'll do fine. And if you have any questions at all as you're writing, feel free to email me. Good luck.